Everybody, thank you very much for taking your seats. The break has been overruled because we went over. We got a chance to listen to Stan Fisher's thoughtful remarks, and he's going to stick around. The two people that are in this audience for whom I have learned so much, and who neither of which I was fortunate enough to work with or under in government, was George Shultz and Stan Fisher. So it's an honor that they're both here. So what we're going to try to do over the course of the next 45 minutes or so is try to broaden this discussion. Maybe some of the discussion has been preoccupied with rules or no rules, but I think Stan Fisher rightly said that in the back of his mind, and I'll paraphrase, he's always worried that some big shock is coming. So what Markus and I are going to try to do over this period is Markus is going to offer a presentation on some of the risks in and around Europe. The reason why I'm particularly honored to be sharing this panel with him is because, unlike some, he's given great thought to risks that cross borders. He's given great thought to the relationship between financial markets and the real economy. And he's also given great thought to unanticipated shocks. So I'm going to defer to Markus to begin with about a 20-minute presentation on that subject. I'll then offer a view about shocks that really build on a couple of the things that Stan mentioned. Then we'll open it up to questions. Markus needs no introduction, a prominent professor of economics at Princeton and a scholar of subjects that are of great interest to many of us here. Markus.
Thanks a lot, and thanks for giving me this opportunity to present my work here. I will talk about something which is based on the book I wrote with Harold James, a historian at Princeton, Joe Belando, as well. So let me start on rules and discretion. We'll come back into this talk as well. But what I wanted to say, I want to give you a flavor why it was so difficult in Europe to solve the euro crisis. And I think one reason is that the ideas matter a lot, and different people have different views how to manage the euro crisis, so different economic philosophies. And I want to show you how these differences manifested it themselves. And you can see some in the US, but much more pronounced in Europe, different philosophies. And before I do this, let me just highlight the watershed moments in the euro crisis. So the euro crisis, essentially in the late 2009, we discovered that in Greece there were big problems with regard to the budget. But then it really started in 2010, and there was a huge power shift. So Europe was very much driven by Brussels, a supranational arrangement. And in the spring of 2000, there was a shift towards an intergovernmental arrangement. So there was essentially a totally different way of managing the things, which was essentially at the European Council, where the government meets and then the government make decisions rather than the Commission, the European Commission making the decisions. So there's this huge power shift. And then there was in 2010, in October, there was a famous walk of Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy on the beach of Deauville, deciding that there will be a restructuring of Greek debt. So there was this private sector involvement, PSI as it was called. Huge disagreement between France and Germany. And then in the summer of 2012, just prior to the Olympic Games, there was a famous whatever it takes speech by Mario Draghi, which really brought the spreads down dramatically, even though not a single euro was spent on this. Another watershed moment was then in spring of 2013, the Cyprus bail-in, a shift from bailout to a bail-in philosophy. And then there was the Brexit. And let me just walk you through the four dimensions which really matter a lot where there are differences. And I want to emphasize really the difference between France and Germany, because these are the two countries which are very influential within Europe. And these are the two countries, if they agree, then things can be moved forward. And many other countries fall in this so-called Rhine divide. So there's the River Rhine, and it divides essentially the views between France and Germany. And I want to do it a little bit in a black and white fashion, some ideal types a la Max Weber, in order to show and highlight, really make it more stark, these differences. And the first difference comes back to the theme of this conference, rules versus discretion. The Germans are very much rule-driven. They want to have ex-ante set up rules, and then they follow these rules, while the French are much more interventionistic, and there is discretion when you can intervene. But actually, it's not so simple. The French philosophy is much more subtle than just discretion. Because if you have discretion, you always have this time inconsistency problem. You're exposed, you would like to promise something or do something, but tomorrow comes around, you use your discretion, change your mind, and people anticipate this, so at the end of the day, you suffer from this huge time inconsistency problem. The French notice and more aware of this problem, so their philosophy is much more. In certain dimensions, we really commit very powerfully. We call this a straitjacket commitment. So you really commit, and I will come to examples. And then in other dimensions, you have to have very powerful discretion. So you have this multi-dimensional space. Some dimension you lock in very forcefully, and the other ones you have to move very flexibly. While the Germans, they like a system which has rules and has safety valves, escape valves, and all the other things. You don't have to intervene exposed at all, okay, or ideally. So that's a different philosophy. Let me give you some examples. One example is, it is actually the French who never want the credit restructuring, no default. It were the Germans who pushed through the PSI, the Greek restructuring of the debt. That's a famous walk I mentioned by Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy in October 2010. So how can you achieve that? And there's a huge debate going on. How can you commit never to default your sovereign bonds? You take your banks as hostage. So you stuff the bonds into your banks, and if you default, you ruin your banking system. This is a huge commitment device. The Germans, on the other hand, they would like to have risk weights on the sovereign bonds in order to have equity cushions. Then you could restructure. And that's a huge battle going on at the moment. How much risk weight should the sovereign bonds have on the balance sheet? Should we be able then to restructure? And the French said, no, no, no. This ruins our commitment device not to default at all. Okay? So you can see this, this diabolic loop or this doom loop between sovereign risk and banking risk, where this, when the sovereign risk goes up, the banks suffer because the bonds suffer in value, hence they give less loans, the economic growth will go down, and the bailout probability goes up. So these two things are linked. That's a good thing to have because it's a powerful commitment device. Okay? If you have a lot of risk weights on your sovereign bonds and the banks have to hold a lot of equity and have shock absorbers, then actually you don't have that. So that's one dimension. You see this playing out very prominently. I put Italy also here on the French side, because that's not only the Rhine divide. There's huge battles going on at the moment. The other thing is, when the Maastricht Treaty was set up, France was pushing not to have any exit rules from the monetary union. Okay? Again, you commit to be part of the currency union. There's no way to get out of it. Well, the Germans are always there, were much more in favor of flexible exchange rates. So if you think about pegs versus flexible exchange rates, the Germans are always in favor of flexible exchange rates, similar to the Canadians and so forth. And that's, if you put it in this Mundell-Fleming trilemma, so you can pick 2 out of the 3 desired features. France is on one side for managed fixed exchange rate, give up your free capital flow, and both want autonomous monetary policy, while Germany is much more for free capital flow and your floating exchange rate. So again, you don't commit yourself. So in French philosophy, you commit yourself in certain dimensions, not to default for a currency union or strict peg. And then you have to actively manage the other dimensions, while Germany has much more a system in mind. We don't have to actively manage, and you have a lot of flexibility built in the system. So that's the first dimension, discretion versus rules. I didn't say committees versus rules, but discretion versus rules. And the second dimension is solidarity versus liability, which played out big time as well. So one dimension is where you say, do you want to have a fiscal union? Essentially, everybody is liable for everybody else. Everybody can go into debt, and then the others are liable for that. That's solidarity, and that's also in the French Revolution already. The German ordoliberalism philosophy is much more that this liability principle. If you are in charge, you're liable. You never separate control from liability. This has to be united. So no bailout. You always have this bail-in philosophy. So you don't want a joint liability. There was this big debate where the French were always pushing for Eurobonds, joint liability, while the Germans refused to have any joint liability bond structure. And Merkel said, not in, as long as I'm in power, she said, not in my lifetime there will be a Eurobond. Okay, that's another dimension. Of course, if you have straitjacket commitment that you never default on your bonds anyway, then you can have joint liability because nobody will ever default, only in extreme, extreme circumstances. The third dimension where they differ a lot is on liquidity, on solvency. And if you think about it, whenever there are financial difficulties and you look back, it was always the French side saying, oh, there's a liquidity problem, we have to intervene. While the Germans said, no, whenever there's a financial difficulties, it's a solvency problem, you just throw good money after bad. Okay? So you shouldn't do it at all. So liquidity problems you can characterize in two forms. So one is you can have this multiple equilibria liquidity problems, where you have a good equilibrium and a bad equilibrium, and all what it takes is a big bazooka. The term big bazooka came out of the UK, where the UK, Cameron was pushing, or Osborne was pushing for a big bazooka, saying, oh, just show the big bazooka, and then all the problems will be solved. And of course, others were pushing on this. And you might argue that Mario Draghi's London speech in the summer of 2012 was such a big bazooka. Essentially, the OMT, never a single euro was spent on the OMT. Mario Draghi gave the speech in the summer of 2012. The OMT was then finalized and announced only in the late summer, August, September, and it was never activated. Nevertheless, all the spreads came down dramatically. Of course, the Germans said, oh, that's just a guarantee extended by the ECB. That's why the spreads came down. But essentially, you can see these differences. Another form of liquidity problems is just if this, the strategic complementarities are less pronounced and the demand curve is not inverted S-shaped, but like an inverted integral or flipped over integral, then it's more an amplification. Then you say, oh, if I put a euro in or a dollar in, I get a huge kick out of it because of this amplification. So the expected net present value of a bailout is positive. I just put a euro in and I get 10 euros out of it, so that's a good deal. And what's the net present value of a bailout? It's the present value of bailing out versus the present value of not bailing out. And what's the present value of not bailing out depends very much what your idea is about, what are the contagion, systemic risk, and all these things. And there's also huge disagreements. So from a French perspective, the bailout, the contagion effects, systemic risks are very, very powerful. And this played out very extremely in the Cyprus crisis in the spring 2013. Remember, Cyprus had this business model to attract black money from Russian oligarchs and others to become a bank center, a financial center and all that. And then the whole thing didn't work anymore. And the Germans, I still remember, said very prominently, if the European taxpayer has to bail out Russian oligarchs, and if this is systemic, then if Cyprus is systemic, then everything is systemic. Okay? So the no bailout rule, which is enshrined in the Maastricht Treaty, will be totally irrelevant anymore because there will be bailouts everywhere. And actually the Cyprus event, the Germans prevailed on this, led to a bail-in rule where then credit and bondholders and even deposit holders, large deposit holders were bailed in, led to a real shift in the thinking in Europe, and the bail-in rule was established, which later in Italy in 2015, it followed 2015, and even today, makes it very, very difficult to fix the banking sector. So, but again, the solvency versus liquidity. Now, the fourth dimension everybody knows about between Keynesian stimulus and austerity and reforms. I should say that, there's a huge difference what to emphasize. We all agree, Keynesian models, I think we all agree that in downturns when aggregate demand is depressed, you don't want to create additional uncertainty through reforms and depress demand even further. But I think what the Germans emphasize, at some point you have to do structural reforms. And when can you do them for political economy reasons? Okay? And typically you can only do these reforms when you're in a crisis, because that's when you can signal to the population, now, we have to do the structural reforms, otherwise, we will suffer in the long run. And that's essentially where there's a difference in emphasis. Do you emphasize the economic arguments, or do you emphasize more the political economy arguments? But in general, what I want to go back and say, is this hopeless in Europe? Because, these two countries, the two main countries which drive the whole economic and political integration across Europe, they have such difference in economic philosophies. How can there be any way common European Union in the long run? And I want to give you some argument that actually there is hope. And the hope is that if you go back in history, the two countries have changed sides several times in terms of what philosophy they follow. Okay? And these differences are not cast in stone. They're actually quite flexible. So you might say in the first side, France is this absolute absolutism is a centrally organized country, you can always intervene ex post, so discretion is very powerful. And in Germany, you can't do this. It's federal structure, thousands of little dukes will intervene, so you need ex ante rules to govern the system. But it was not this case. So it was very different before the Second World War. So if you go through history, I will skip the first one. The laissez-faire approach, not to intervene, that's a French thing. Laissez-faire is a French word. And it was in Germany in the 18th and 19th century where there was this cameralism of state tradition. Frederick the Great intervened a lot in Prussia, or even in the 19th century in imperialistic Germany. There was a lot of interventionistic. And it was only after the Second World War that these two things reversed. And I can go briefly into that. So in Germany, of course, it were the Nazis who were very centralized power, a lot of intervention. And there was this school, the Ordo-Liberalists in Freiburg developed this school. There should be not so much arbitrariness in the government intervening all the time. So you want to restrain the government's power by ex-ante rules. And this was with regard to any type of interventionistic approaches. And they promoted very much competition in order to avoid any concentration of power, be it political or be it economically. So you really push competition. That's essentially what they pushed. And then the Allies liked this approach because it took power away from Berlin and distributed it more evenly. And Germany had the Wirtschaftswunder and everything, the economic miracle, and everything went very well and fell in love with this new arrangement. In France, it was the opposite. Austerity was in the 1930s in France. They cut very much down the budget in the 1930s. And at that time, the biggest part of the budget was military spending. And then when in 1940 Germany attacked France and ran over them, it was argued that it was because of austerity which made France vulnerable against the German attack. And that's when the whole planning interventionistic approach became much more powerful. So they switched to the other side. So given that, I think you can see that this difference in the economic philosophies, they're not cast in stones, they can actually switch. Now let me end in my little time. So the Maastricht Treaty, which was signed in 92 and set up the European Union, focused a lot on these four dimensions I was talking about. It ignored very much the finance component. Why? Because in 1992, in the 80s when it was negotiated, late 80s when it was negotiated, we didn't live through the Southeast Asia crisis, which had this huge contagion waves. So we had to experience, the financial instability was not so at the forefront of their minds at that time. It was much more the fiscal aspects which played a big role. And I mentioned already that the diabolic loop is doom loop, which one side sees as a commitment device and the other side sees as an amplification and destabilizer. And one reason why you have this doom loop or diabolic loop is because there's no safe asset which is a European-wide safe asset. Okay? And that's one proposal which is I want to mention briefly, is to make sure that you have some safe asset which is provided not by a subset of countries of the euro area, but is provided by all over in a symmetric way across Europe. So let me just illustrate what's going on at the moment. At the moment, if the crisis becomes more severe, you have flight to safety from the peripheral countries to the core countries. So there's flight to safety across borders because the safe asset is just provided by a subset of Europe. So the idea is I would like to put forward is this European safe bond, or it's called now sovereign bond-backed securities in official lingo. The idea is essentially it's just a tranching idea. So you just put 19 sovereign bonds together, up to 60% of GDP, let's say, and then you issue a senior bond and a junior bond. There's no joint liability, it's just simple pooling and tranching. And now if you have severe crisis, now what you want is that the banks, they're holding essentially the senior bond and not the junior bond. Of course, we're destroying this commitment device, but we stabilize the banks. And the second advantage is now if there's flight to safety, it will not go from the peripheral countries to the core, it will go from the junior bond to the senior bond. And both bonds are European. Okay? So they're not national bonds, they're not bonds with a passport, they are bonds without a passport. They're both European and you can stabilize the situation by doing so. Now let me conclude and just summarize what I just said. I think what mattered a lot and why the Euro crisis was so difficult to manage was that ideas matter. It's not only about interests. And you can see there's many examples where the interests are between Germany and France are very aligned, but the way they think, the lens through which they look through the lens of ideas, and they come to different conclusions and fight very hard for this. In 2010, there was a huge power shift away from Brussels towards the capitals first, with the involvement of the IMF. So the IMF was brought in. That moved power away from Brussels, shifted it very much to an intergovernmental arrangement. And then with Deauville, essentially it was between Paris and Berlin. I should just say, so after there was the private sector involvement, all the peripheral countries know if Germany were to whisper something to the media, there's something wrong, the yields would go up. And this gave a lot of extra leverage to Berlin and to some extent also Paris. There's the Rhine divide across the River Rhine, and different economic philosophies in many dimensions, but it can change, and it's not cast in stone. So there is a hope for convergence down the road. And then ultimately, I've just mentioned some ideas, in particular on this SP's idea with the European Safe Bond. Instead of having national bonds, which leads to flight to safety across borders, you have essentially flight to safety from a junior bond to a senior bond, and that can be stabilizing, shifts you to a different equilibrium. And it takes the sovereign risk out of the bank's balance sheets. Thanks.
Thank you, Markus. Very helpful. So Markus, to my ear, told the story of reform. Stan Fisher earlier talked about the Bank of England and how they conduct business. They have been engaging in reforms about how they conduct business, make policy. What I'm going to do to try to build on those two discussions is tell a story of reform as well. Stan says that he likes it better to hear stories than data, so I'll try to put it simply. This is the story of a small central bank who, however imperfectly, engaged in a battle in the financial crisis in the US and may have secured a peace, but it's not a durable peace, a sustainable peace, unless the central bank undertakes real reforms. So as we gather here at Stanford, where I showed up 25 years ago knocking on George's door, as we gather here, look around Silicon Valley, everything's just perfect. It's another beautiful day. The long drought is over. The flowers are in full bloom. Buildings are being erected. Even we at Hoover cannot resist the temptation to put up a building of our own. Students are gravitating new fields of study. They go to the edge of campus. Their ideas are being funded. Low-cost computing power, new analytic tools. Everything's working out perfectly. According to popular lore here in the Valley, we're in a long epic of prosperity. We're in a sustainable and durable equilibrium to which we should all say, what could possibly go wrong? That's the central question that central banks should be asking as well. And this isn't antithetical to the remit that we all know. The Fed was founded in response to a crisis. Financial and economic shocks have marked the last century. They've tested the economy. And these economic and financial shocks, those things that Stan Fisher said in the back of his mind as a central banker he always worries about, nothing could put the Fed farther away from its statutory objectives of price stability and stable employment, maximum employment, than another shock. But leading Fed officials at press conferences and speeches are confidently predicting a benign external environment as far as the eye can see. Steady growth, stable inflation, and financial assets which, according to their models, are at perfectly fair values. They've all but proclaimed their mission accomplished, their targets achieved. From the latest view of their dots, they're virtually on top of each other. The last time I can recall such uniformity of opinion among central bankers, among many, if not most, in the academy, and among market participants was about 10 years ago. We gather here today at another important time, where the broad conduct of US economic policies that George referenced are now being debated in Washington. So many of the issues that were discussed before this panel, discussed yesterday, they sure matter, but they matter in the context of something broader. I can't help but opine just with a few thoughts on them. First, we shouldn't sit here and encourage policymakers to fiddle with the natural rate of employment to rationalize the near-term conduct of policy. We shouldn't accept their newfound conviction that some low R star is a fixed feature of future monetary policy. And we should resist the pseudo-scientific precision being assigned to the Fed's preferred measure of inflation. This measure of inflation is not reliable to the 10th or 100th of a percent. It is not a good arbiter of the output gap, and it is especially poor proxy for financial stability. So judgments on these issues about the balance sheet and R star, these matter. I'm not trying to dismiss them, but I want to put them in the context of the Fed's more difficult and consequential mission to mitigate the probabilities of and damage to the economy that may arise from the next shock. Our mandate about inflation and employment demand nothing less. So, to Markus's point, we should stand here and engage in a fundamental rethinking of the Fed's strategy, its tools, its governance, and its communications. We should not take the cacophony as is and say we can't do better. We shouldn't take the deliberation process of the Fed and say, well, we're stuck with it. What we should do is ask ourselves, what can we do to improve it? That would clarify the Fed's responsibilities. It would improve the Fed's decision-making, and it would bolster its credibility. A reformed central bank could prove useful to mitigate the risks of this next crisis and prove essential to a forceful and efficacious response to these inevitable challenges. There's no holiday from history, there's no holiday from shocks, and we policymakers, past and present, should not squander this grace period where all seems to be going perfectly well on a victory lap. So I don't want to leave you with the impression that somehow I have a perfect crystal ball. I don't, but neither do they. The most important forecaster trait is humility. The most important forecasting measure is the confidence interval. The most common forecasting error is groupthink. And the best forecasting fix is among us. A humble, independent, diverse, intellectually rigorous, and cohesive group who are not satisfied with the status quo. The Fed has a lot riding on its outlook, too much in my view, and its institutional inclinations give me pause. Policymakers should evaluate the tail risks of their forecasts, frankly, with more care than the central tendency. And they must judge their ability to respond in less likely, but frankly more disruptive scenarios. Now maybe as I was putting pen to paper on my trip out here, I thought the scars of the last crisis might be burdening me with unnecessary worry. Maybe the levers of macroeconomic policy have made economic, credit, financial cycles an artifact of history. Maybe we're going to get another perfectly satisfactory period in front of us of moderate growth and inflation. I wouldn't bet on it. We should not mistake the present situation for permanence. We should not confuse the post-crisis period of benign aggregate conditions with a sustainable, durable equilibrium. We should particularly not be comforted by the low implied measures of volatility across financial markets. We should query whether a sudden shift in expectations would make these asset prices an amplifier of distress rather than the shock absorber they ought to be. We should not encourage the financial markets to be the handmaiden of the central bank. We should allow asset prices to be an independent source of information because we need that to conduct policy. And we should not allow a failure of imagination, a failure of preparation, or a lack of courage to keep any of us from pursuing a robust reform agenda equal to these risks. And we should not conflate a forward-looking policy of reform with a policy of looking back, pining for the good old days when monetary policy was ostensibly perfected. The conduct of monetary policy has never been easy. It has never been simple. And the lessons learned in the last decade alone about money, credit, finance, global interconnectedness should be incorporated into a 21st century monetary framework. The challenges of the next several years are different from those that confronted the Fed in the 1970s when Paul Volcker stood tall. They're different than the challenges that confronted Ben Bernanke in the darkest days of the financial crisis. But the challenges are no less consequential. Let me say just a word, if I could, about these 4 areas of reform And then obviously Markus and I will open it up to questions about reforms both in Europe and the US. First is a reform of strategy. It is a false choice. I hope not a false choice laid down to this point between unfettered discretion on the one hand and a mechanical rule on the other. But the familiar refrain from the last crisis that a plan beats no plan might be true, but a strategy beats a plan every time. And as far as I can tell, I haven't seen one. A durable strategy can be understood and relied upon. It should be operative through the business and financial cycle. And it would scarcely require Fed speakers to rush to update their guidance to market participants between blackout periods. A reform strategy would make the medium-term time horizon its North Star. The Fed wouldn't be beguiled by the whimsy of day traders and the variance of lagging data. The Fed's reaction function would be less sensitive to normal financial market ups and downs. They happen and they should. A reform strategy would account for the possibility of demand and supply side changes to the economy, some of which George was referencing in his question to Stan. And it should show greater respect for the micro foundations of macroeconomics. To inform future inflation and output, it should take special note of contemporaneous real-time data and pay careful attention to forward-looking trends. Silicon Valley is awash with new analytic tools to figure out not what happened a month ago or 3 months ago, but what's happening in real time. Those should be front and center in policymakers' playbooks. And to Markus's point about the experience in Europe, I'll only add this. This is a parochial American view I'm sharing. But if we don't have a strategy, I don't know how the rest of the world's central banks are exactly supposed to conduct their business. International spillovers in monetary policy include intellectual spillovers. The G20 relies on the US to deliver strong growth for sure, but foreign central banks and foreign ministers rely upon a steady and well-understood Fed strategy. Absent reform of the Fed's framework, foreign central bank choices risk being in limbo, and the lack of the reform at the Fed makes it more likely the next foreign financial shock, of which Markus made some reference, could find its way to our shores. Second, reform tools. I heard a question earlier about tools. The Fed's comfort with its conduct of monetary policy seems to me based in part on these Dodd-Frank inspired reforms in the regulatory area. The argument goes something like this. Monetary policy's mission can be focused on the modal outlook because these other prudential policies will manage tail risks. I don't believe it. Microprudential regulatory changes in the post-crisis era, most of which were taken up by Dodd-Frank, but the Fed had authority to do itself, are inadequate to deal with the next financial shock. And the macroprudential policy toolkit, which the Bank of England is testing, the Fed is talking about, is underdeveloped to deal with these tail risks. Until these areas of regulation and supervision are made more robust, monetary bears the substantial burden, and we ought not fool or think otherwise. As to the tools being undertaken by the Fed, I must say I'm confused by the normalization strategy. Its preferred sequencing of rate increases and balance sheet reductions differ markedly from what was agreed back in the war room when we conceived of QE to start with. There might be good reason for that. But the transmission mechanism of rate changes and the transmission mechanism of balance sheet adjustments are markedly different than projected. And we must admit so too are the distributional effects. This merits a more robust public explanation, and it shouldn't just be passed over. According to the Fed's recent commentary, the balance sheet taper could well come by the end of this year. In my view, the Fed would be prudent to engage in substantive discussions with the Treasury Department so that the flow of issuance is well coordinated and the duration of outstanding securities understood. The absence of clarity around important questions at this late date does no favors to the Fed, does no favors to the rest of government or to the broader economy. 2 more points. The next is on governance. The Fed's existing model of governance is ripe for reform. The Fed looks to me to be too far in a defensive crouch, and it should resist the reflexive response that any proposed changes in its governance are somehow a threat to the institution's independence. My time at the Fed and subsequent experience at the Bank of England confirm the wisdom of what former colleague and Professor Peter Conti Brown wrote recently when he said the following: having the right institutional design isn't a sideshow to the real questions of monetary policy and financial regulation. Governance may in fact be the whole show. Changes are in order in how the Fed organizes itself, conducts its business, deliberates policy choices, and makes its decisions. In short, deliberation should be more robust, decisions less constrained. Stan referenced the comparison that I did between the Bank of England and how they conduct policy and the Fed, and he said, I think, with plenty of nuance, the comparison doesn't stack up very favorably for the US, and we shouldn't let that stand. The existing governance structure reinforces a groupthink. It places the Fed at considerable institutional risk when the next crisis strikes, and it makes the next crisis more likely to be harmful. As those of us in this room know, this is our third experiment at a central bank, and it's our third because the first two didn't end up as we would have liked. The Fed is on, I think, more dangerous ground in thinking about how it should run itself and how it can survive and thrive in the next crisis than many would have us believe. Fourth, communications. The Fed's come a long way from former Bank of England Governor Montague Norman's rather famed aphorism, where he counseled central banks to never explain and never excuse. Well, I suppose nothing compares with the zeal of the converted. The Fed of modern times is always communicating. Communications has become so important to Fed policymakers, they now find themselves doing something new, communicating about communicating, lest they be misunderstood. Leading policymakers believe the so-called taper tantrum in 2013 was a communications failure that caused deep financial instability. So they must somehow toil to ensure that that error is not repeated. The spike in volatility of the long bond, however unanticipated, however clumsy, served as a useful reminder to investors that complacency is a killer. If that's the magnitude of the tail risk that consumes the central bank, we indeed have a lot to be worried about. Some emerging market economies coming out of the taper tantrum were pushed to put their houses in order, and bond investors were made a bit less complacent. In the monthly window between FOMC meetings, there are dozens of statements, minutes, speeches, forecasts, predictions, and reporting informed by policymakers. Great attention is paid by policymakers to the latest data and inflation prints. That's no doubt the case this morning. And the immediate effect that has on the next decision. What does this morning's announcement about monthly payrolls say about June? I probably speak in the minority here. There is little knowledge to be learned from the latest Fed forecast, little insight to be gleaned from the last piece of government data. I worry that Fed policymakers find themselves score settling with one another, while Fed watchers find themselves score counting hawks and doves. All the while, the big questions for the economy go unanswered, and the big risks unaddressed. Bagehot, I think, captured the essence of this dynamic when he said, quote, "Two hosts of eager disputants on this subject ask of every discussant the same question, are you with us or against us? And they care for little else." Well, as I've tried to say over the last 15 minutes or so, there's much about else we should care. So I'll end where I began here at Stanford. Those in the bright white lab coats on the other side of campus in the life sciences lab, they should be the starry-eyed true believers. Those wearing the t-shirts, the coders in the Palo Alto garages, they can be the eternal optimists. And those in the venture community, they can be the evangelists. And I wish them nothing but fame and fortune. But central bankers should be different. Their 15 minutes of fame should end when the crisis ends. And they should use the interregnum to take stock, deepen their knowledge base, bolster their capabilities, and fundamentally reform the institution before the next siren sounds. Because when it does, the Fed is unlikely to have conventional or unconventional armaments in sufficient supply. So the Fed's credibility will be at a premium. And this credibility will be significantly enhanced by first reforming its own policies and practices. So with that, I'd say, Markus, I'd be happy to take your questions. I know we're running a bit over, but we've been given a bit of a leave. So why don't we pause there and see what's on anyone's minds. See a question here on the aisle. Microphone's coming right here.
Thank you, Volker Wieland from Frankfurt University. I want to direct a comment at Markus, but it's not unrelated to the thoughts of Kevin Warsh in the US. If you think of the change, you mentioned the change in Germany, right, with World War II, and an important element was actually outside intervention and terrible experience. So I'm a professor in Frankfurt. We're actually located nowadays in what used to be the headquarters of IG Farben, a big chemical conglomerate, and what used to be the US Army headquarters of Europe, and was the seat of the military government, after World War II. And for example, there were many of the things setting up the rules and institutions of the state were basically handed as proposals from the military governors to the Germans, to the heads of the German states. For example, Frankfurt Documents, which then were an important influence. So that's a name which became famous, the Frankfurt Documents, handed by the military government over, which became a big influence on the later what was the basic law, or our version of a constitution. Same with the currency. So it's this combination which made the change, the horrible experience of disaster and this intervention. And if you move to today, the position you described also has a lot to do with experience. Contrary to France, we actually have a federalist structure. So there is in the population a big view on, yes, we could have a union of states, but the experience has not been all that good, because contrary to the US, we haven't had this working. The focus on no bailout is really because we have constantly bail-in Germany. So within Germany, we have the German states, the German Länder, and we have permanent recipients of transfers, Bremen, Berlin, Saarland. So that's where the proposals are coming from. And without going further, I think it's not going to be sufficient to just invent another financial instrument where you have to ask yourself, why isn't the market already offering that? But I think what you need is really this, to make this work, and not having Marine Le Pen win in France, you need a focus on making control, when you're in control of your budget, of your policies, that you also have to be responsible, liable for the consequences. And, without going to a central government, which the French want the least, as you can see from the number of votes Marine Le Pen gets,
Markus,
you really have to move to that system.
Thank you.
Okay, so I agree with many things. So the US was instrumental, essentially, after the year to make this shift in Germany. It was also the first economic minister who essentially ruled against the US and removed the price controls, which led to this economic miracle. So there was some back and forth, and there was essentially the Ordoliberalisten had a big influence in Frankfurt as well. But the argument might be made, well, does it take a war to really change the attitudes towards an economic philosophy? And I don't think it really takes a war. I mean, I think the Euro crisis was a severe event for many of the citizens in Europe, and it might lead to a shift, and it led already to a shift. So there was a big shift towards a more bail-in philosophy. It might not have trickled down to the average citizen, but there is already a big rethink going on. You can see that there's some disagreement about this liability principle. I mean, the closest which comes to my mind is our principal agent type of modeling. So you have some risk sharing for some extreme tail risks. And when you're not in the tail risk region, or when you're not in the tail risk, then you have this liability principle biting much more powerfully than because you're in charge of it. But if something extraordinary happens, then there might be, for some severe aspects, there might be, a way to share risks across nations, and over time it might grow that you share more risks. So that was the same thing when Germany was united in the 19th century. There were also even different armies from Bavaria and Prussia and so forth, and it took a long time to come closer together. Are the SPs, will they solve all the problems? I don't think so. I mean, they're just solving very particular problems. It's just a clever way to avoid joint liability, which is, I think, the political landscape is not there, and it's also not wise at the moment to have some joint liability. So it's a way to solve two problems. One is this diabolic loop or doom loop between banking risk and sovereign risk, which would make some restructuring more possible down the road because you lift this commitment device, and it would redirect flight to safety away from cross-border flows from a junior bond to a senior bond. So that's essentially just rechanneling things, destabilizing fundamental flows.
Great. Other questions?
David Mulford, Hoover. In your presentation, the word Brexit appeared. You made the comment that it doesn't necessarily take a war to make change. So I wonder whether you could look forward over the next couple of years of the Brexit negotiation and speculate or explain how you think this might affect the Euro development, core ideas, and the ideas that you made in your presentation, because I think we're entering a very significant and uncertain period here.
Yeah, I agree with you that the Brexit will be a difficult period, in particular because the expectations and also the expectations which are projected to populations are not consistent with each other. So in the UK, there's some expectation everything will be fine and there will be no problems, and they can still be part of the common market and so forth. And there will be some huge disappointments, and the dangers are big that you play the national card later on. What we have seen so far, and this comes also from Trump's initial close cooperation with Russia, that the Europeans outside of the UK, they were actually moving closer together. So there was there's still a threat in Eastern Europe from the Russian side, and this led actually to a closer movement together, or continental Europe, and that also united Europe more with regard to the United Kingdom. And whether that's healthy or not, it would be nice if you can keep the United Kingdom as close as possible with the continental Europe, in particular for trade reasons, but also for security reasons, because the United Kingdom is still one of the major military players in Europe.
Here.
Thanks. Anne Saphir, Reuters. I just wanted to ask a quick political economy question to you, Kevin. What kind of indications are you seeing that the administration wants the kind of approach to the Fed and the kind of changes that you've been advocating? So
the good news about being back at Stanford is we get to explain what we think is the right outcome. We don't need to necessarily be burdened by the opinion polls or latest comings and goings in Washington. Now, I would say this, both in the context of Dodd-Frank on the regulatory side and in the conduct of monetary policy, there's much Congress might choose to do to change the rules. There's a lot of self-help that can be applied too. Almost all the authority granted to the Federal Reserve and other agencies under Dodd-Frank was authority that broadly the Federal Reserve already had. There's some exceptions to that. Almost all the changes that I'm discussing broadly about having a strategy, clearing up and fixing governance, being clear about the distributional consequences of tools, being clear to the world about how they'd work and why, and communications, these are reforms that can be taken up by the institution. In some sense, my real view is if the institution doesn't look first to itself for reform, then they might not like what happens at the other end of the political lens, particularly after the next slowdown, after the next recession, after the next shock. So that's really a call for self-help. You and others can judge whether it's feasible in the broader Washington consensus. But part of the benefit of being 3,000 miles away from Washington is we can sort of try to focus on what do we think is the right answer and leave it to others who are actually now burdened with these responsibilities to decide whether they wish to take it up. Other questions? Jim.
Jim Bullard, St. Louis Fed. So I have a question for Kevin. You seem to characterize one of the major problems of the Fed as groupthink. How would you, first of all, I'm not sure that that is the core problem, but maybe you can defend that a little bit. And what would you do to break down groupthink? What kinds of things do you think the Fed should be doing in that dimension?
Yeah. So it's a great question. I've written a paper on it, but I'll try to summarize a couple of the ideas here, Jim. I think there is a tendency, particularly as Stan suggests, when you have a committee as large as the committee is that was established by Congress, amid uncertainties, to try to find an anchor, try to find some commonality, and that's a natural phenomenon of human behavior. And FIRBIS, the dynamic stochastic general equilibrium model that is at the core of the Fed's thinking and has been at the core of its thinking for 40 years, though revisions are made all the time, I think ends up being the device through which a lot of discussions are had in the conduct of policy, at least back in my day. I've been gone for 6 years. The flaws in the model, though, should be not hidden but exposed. So a couple of things, as you know better than I, that are missing from the model. For example, financial markets. There are no asset prices in the model. Well, why would that be? Well, in 1978, we might have well believed that assets are always perfectly efficient, so we needn't clutter up this elegant model with such a thing. But if we think broadly about what we learned about the crisis, what we learned broadly from Markus's work about booms and busts and shocks along the last 100 years, you would say, well, market prices can be very useful and efficient, but not always so. And you'd also recognize that when the Fed's objective function in the crisis and thereafter was actually to move asset prices around, that asset prices might be fair and efficient with the thumb of the Fed on it. So that model doesn't include asset prices, and yet almost all, or I should be a little bit more fair, much of the benefit of monetary policy through quantitative easing happens through asset prices, is quite something to be missing from the core. Second, from the model, as you know, the model does not include the rest of the world. So we add a couple of lines and call them net exports, and we call it our global economic model. Well, again, in 1978, that model might have been a fair approximation of the United States, largely domestic economy. Shocks, inflation, prices, capital flows overseas don't necessarily interfere with the output gap at the core of the model. That's not the world we're in today. Everything that's happening in Europe, everything that's happening in Britain is of second-order consequence, if not first-order consequence. You know, I think the right reply is Ben Bernanke's, for whom you know I've got great affection, and he would say, well, it takes a model to beat a model. Well, if we had that other model, I would be serving it up here. We don't. But we shouldn't hide from the frailties of the model. We shouldn't all hew to a model that we know is fundamentally broken and misses key elements. So a broader discussion about what ails us would be one part of it, and I'll only answer with a second. I think the groupthink comes not from bad intentions, it comes from the best of intentions, and it comes from a willingness and a desire for there to be comity in the committee, a willingness to get along. This is about good intentions of patriots that are trying to do the right thing for the economy. But if the backgrounds of the patriots are so similar, if the long tenured history in the system is so deep, some fresh air could be useful. Fresh air from the real side of the economy, fresh air from financial markets, fresh air from what's happening overseas. And so I think in the attempt actually at civility, we end up at press conferences where the chair has a very difficult task to speak for the committee. And the chair, as a result, uses other devices to show the commonality, like these dot plots. The only problem with these dot plots is they've been wrong for 9 years. Wouldn't say mine would be right, but imagine if at the next FOMC meeting, at the next Fed press conference, we didn't dwell on the change of 1/10 to inflation, 1/10 the change to GDP. We just sort of put that aside. And we said, well, you know what the committee's really been struggling at, and what I'm going to make the focus of the summer of 2017 is the productivity puzzle. So if we don't have that right, we don't have our star right. If we don't have our star right, we don't have monetary policy right. It is not a sign of weakness to say what we don't know. It's a sign of strength. So those are the sorts of things, and I think the governance, which we've looked at across countries, including the ECB and the Bank of England, have a lot of ways in which this same group of people could end up with more robust deliberations, feel more comfortable dissenting or agreeing, and have a discussion where in 2017 we don't give 112 more speeches on the economic outlook about dots. And we devoted $2.5 billion of taxpayer money to the fundamental questions which are more consequential. And that $2.5 billion, I would argue, the incredible brain power of 650 PhD economists could be focused on these big and harder questions about productivity, about shocks, about the role of markets, about the bleeding of asset prices and international flows. We have the capability, you have the capability to do it, but I think it needs to be brought to the fore. think we've got time for another question or nope, that's it. John cut you off, Michael, not me. I apologize.
Let's start again at 10:35.
Excellent, thank you.